Yesterday was the 20th anniversary of the air attacks that took place in the United States on 9/11. I'm sure that fact was not lost on many of you, not with a widespread media coverage of that major milestone. For some here, I am sure there is a personal connection to that national tragedy, because 2 of the 4 hijacked flights did depart from Boston Logan International Airport. Others of you have told me that you first came to a Unitarian Universalist congregation, and indeed perhaps this very church, just after 9/11, looking for spiritual community in the aftermath of such terror. There are obvious echoes between September 2001 and September 2021. You may have noticed them yourself. America is still struggling with a mass trauma as the COVID pandemic continues, and our citizens stay beset by fears. Today is the first time that all of you are back at UU Wellesley Hills after having been gone from its pews for more than 18 months. Remember that we closed the campus to the public early in March 2020, quite a while ago now. So this may be an emotional day for us. I want to take a moment to let the truth of that settle across this gathering. Every one of us has been holding a lot for the past year and a half. And this morning, this sanctuary is holding every one of us together in the same space. Yes, the space itself has changed in subtle ways. Alternate pews are roped off, and a box of disposable masks sits by the doorway in case one of our members or visitors forgot theirs at home. We have posted cautionary signs from the Commonwealth at our entrances, alerting people of the measures they should take to protect themselves from possible contagion. Bottles of hand sanitizer have been placed by the stacks of orders of service. You'll notice our plates are no longer being passed. And thanks to a handful of tireless volunteers, we have a couple of new cameras installed. So people who are not with us today, who are not yet comfortable with in-person worship, can still participate in our Ingathering celebration this year. Air filters are running alongside circulating fans, and all of our windows are open. Danger is literally in the air, and you are here nonetheless. I am glad you are here. Those of you whose situations have allowed you to assume some risk have done just that. You are being brave. It is never easy to reemerge into a world that has been so badly shaken. You may feel a bit shaky yourself still. It's fine to admit that, especially when you are among friends. I can tell you that the weather yesterday felt eerily familiar to me. In September 2001, I was living in New York City and starting my second year of study at seminary. The first day of classes was on 9/11, and I was on my way to campus that morning. The sky was a brilliant blue, dotted with downy clouds. When I got on the express train in Brooklyn, that was all that I saw overhead. The subway took us under the East River over to Manhattan. By the time we got there, all the cars on our 3 train were filled with smoke. We passengers knew that because we kept passing through them in sequence in search of better air. At the end of the line, there were no such cars. When we passengers were told to evacuate the Wall Street stop, we were relieved, since we were convinced that our train was on fire. But soon we realized that the city above was burning. My account, like that of many New Yorkers' accounts of the day, is a catalog both of untold horrors and unforeseen kindnesses by countless strangers. At the time, I had no idea why downtown was ablaze, but I was soon seized by the notion that I would go to my father's high-rise apartment in Battery Park City. It did not matter to me that my father had died a couple of years earlier or that I no longer had keys. My brothers had kept it, and I assumed that Carl or one of the other doormen would just let me in. I was convinced that I would find safety there. Of course, this was not the case. A man in a business suit soon told me so as he pointed me in the opposite direction of where I was headed, explaining that buildings everywhere were collapsing around us. That helped explain the ash swirling. The man who had torn T-shirts into makeshift masks handed me one without my even asking and told me to walk straight to the riverbank. Across the rivers, breezes would carry some of the smoke away. On my way there, in the midst of throngs of thousands, I was given bottles of spring water by women who were passing them out on the sidewalk. Only later did I wonder, who were those women? Where did they come from? How did they get those bottles of water? An older woman who saw the mobile phone in my hand asked if she could borrow it to call her daughter. Her daughter was around my age, apparently, and still somewhere downtown. So I lent my phone to her. The woman called and called, but could not go through. At that point, all the cellular networks were overloaded. So reluctantly, she returned my phone. I took hold of her hand then and went on holding it as we walked. The pressure of the crowd was pushing us all back toward the East River. From its banks, I could see the throngs of people crossing the Brooklyn Bridge, and I suddenly understood that I, too, soon would cross it, returning to the distant shore from whence I came. A couple of uniformed officers stationed near the entrance of the bridge told us in an entirely perfunctory way that pedestrians were not allowed to walk on the Brooklyn Bridge, that it was reserved for vehicles. I and the scores of people around me thanked them in the most polite tones imaginable for that information as we stepped out onto the expanse and walked our way across the Brooklyn Bridge. Whenever people talk about the currents of history, about how we get swept up into it and how quickly it can carry all of us away from our intended and anticipated destinations, I think of that view of the East River from the height of the Brooklyn Bridge. On the other side of it, just as I had arrived in my own borough, a man in a yarmulke handed me a moist cloth to start wiping away the soot from my face, chest, arms, hands. He asked me how I was doing. I very clearly remembered replying that I was fine. He told me that all his years in Jerusalem, he had never seen a terrorist attack like this. He shook his head in disbelief, and then I thanked him and we said our farewells. Back in my apartment building, the landlord showed me in and let me use their landline to call my family and friends and tell them that I had survived and that I had gotten home safe. There are numerous details I am omitting here for the sake of brevity, but the reality of 9/11 was that the discrete events unfolded over a single morning up and down the Eastern Corridor. It was the aftermath that was so extensive, that felt so interminable, especially to New Yorkers. Once classes resumed at the seminary, I started riding the express train again to campus. For several weeks, the city continued to burn. All of us knew that acrid smell along certain stretches of the subway track. I developed asthma, and eventually I had to move out of Brooklyn altogether. Battery Park City was closed off for months, and I never saw my father's apartment again. Relief funds were established and medical registries opened. And New York with its characteristic grit and determination, reopened and rebuilt. Some of the people who had left the city waiting for things to settle down returned, but others did not. Over time, casualties did continue to mount. Just last weekend, actually, I went to a memorial service for a friend and colleague who died from medical complications related to her exposure on 9/11. After only 18 months, we have gotten in the habit of speaking about long COVID, and that phenomenon is all too real. So too is the phenomenon of long 9/11, the disastrous withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan. It's just symptomatic of it. Like many New Yorkers, I participated in Not in Our Name protests against the wars in the Middle East. Yet the resolution of any mass trauma can be painful and prolonged. Recovery happens at different rates for different populations, but if it is to happen at all, it has to be intentional. It has to be supported. Within a decade of 9/11, I was a senior clinician teaching in a trauma program at a psychotherapy institute in New York City. This was not mere happenstance. A large part of my own recovery from trauma was helping others recover from theirs. One key insight of trauma treatment that is important for each of us to keep in mind is that we ought to start with the ending, meaning we ought to open our story with its epilogue. Understand that our ingathering this morning is an epilogue of sorts. In the spring of 2020, COVID cases reached their peak in Massachusetts. Since then, the situation here has steadily improved. People have been vaccinated. Treatments have been developed. Survival rates have increased in our hospitals. We are exceedingly fortunate that many of our worst fears about the pandemic did not come to pass in this place, though I know some in our number were not spared. By and large, though, we have survived. By and large, we are still surviving. Take note of that now, and understand that our collective recovery will take many years yet, or decades even. Our political system is suffering from long COVID. Our healthcare networks are suffering from long COVID. Our cultural, social, educational institutions are all suffering from long COVID. They will recover to the extent that we tend to them as a society. We have to be patient and we have to be persistent. The way I have told my own 9/11 story has evolved over the years. For a while, I was a guest preacher in New York area pulpits, delivering some variant of what I now call the survivor sermon. It was needful witness at the time. To the extent I am preaching another survivor sermon this morning, though, it has changed in material ways. I do not remember the terror of that morning as vividly as the tenderness of it. What others handed to me, what I handed to them, all the hands that reached out and took hold of one another time after time. I do recall smoke, but I also recall being near flowing rivers, as the poet wrote in his adaptation of Psalm 1, surrounded by women, men, individuals whose illusions of security were sent up in smoke, and who in that moment opened their hearts to the way things were, in recognition of the way things could never, ever be again. The crucial difference between 9/11 and COVID, though, is that while 9/11 brought Americans together in memorials, vigils, protests, COVID sent us home to separate rooms and screens, So many of our greatest helpers have operated from us at a remove behind shields and masks, in delivery trucks, over phone lines, and often unstable internet connections, such that we would not recognize them on sight. On the subway a couple of years after 9/11, I spied a man who had sat across from me on that 3 train that morning, and he immediately recognized me. Larry and I had a good long talk on the 3 train, like old school chums would. When trauma collapses our timelines, we need to carefully reconstruct them. We need to remind ourselves that yesterday was then, today is now, and tomorrow is still coming. The worst case scenario is not our perpetual reality. Things have not always been awful, nor will they be awful forever. An open future is to some extent still possible. As impatient as we might feel with the spread of virus variants and the proliferation of COVID protocols, we need to remember that we have actually come most of the way through a global pandemic together, not separately, as it may have started to seem in many long months apart. We have been sustained by the sacrifice and kindness of so many people. Take a moment, please, just to catalog them in your mind, in your life, in your neighborhood, in your state, in your country, in your world. The kindness and sacrifice of so many people. The members and friends of UU Wellesley Hills are passing along to the other side of this pandemic because of what everyone here has contributed along the way. We cannot allow ourselves to forget that. The same historic currents that captured us have stirred up a strong spirit as well. If we find ourselves still shaken, we might want to ask if some part of us is not, to borrow that Inuit shaman's phrase, trembling with joy. Either way, we remain in motion. We have begun our reemergence, our recovery, our repair, our return.